session on because obviously we're thinking there will at some point be a general election, and general elections are usually prime opportunities for lobbying for new sorts of policy. But we also know from all of the debates we've had today that one of the biggest problems that we face with our media and tech giants is that they've become too powerful. And they've not only become too powerful to regulate, but they've also become so powerful that they pull the puppet strings of many of our politicians. And so what we get is a kind of sordid grace and favour relationship where they say, less regulation please and better coverage for you. And we are in that game again in the run-up to another general election. And I just wanted to pull out for you, as an example of that, some research that's been done by Hacked Off, another media campaign organisation, that was looking at the numbers of meetings between press and government. These aren't meetings in order to get stories. These are meetings in order to gain influence. In the year from September 2022, there were 534 meetings between press and government. That's actually, I think this is astounding. Actually, that's 45 meetings a month. That's more than one a day. 218 of those were between the Murdoch press and government. Murdoch himself met with government representatives 12 times. That's an average of once a month of Rupert Murdoch himself, and 6 times with the Prime Minister. On the morning of the announcement of the media bill, which we're going to talk about today, it was recorded there were 3 conversations, meetings with newspaper editors. And the reason those meetings happened is because the media bill has one small sentence in it which repeals Section 40 of the Crime and Courts Act, which is the final piece of the jigsaw puzzle for a Leveson-compliant regulatory framework, which they've been lobbying to get rid of for 12 years, ever since that Leveson framework came into play. This media bill will repeal that Section 40. So we can see how close governments and political elites and media elites are, and how problematic that can be. But we can't give up trying on that basis. So much of the work that we do in media reform is about trying to lobby on various policy initiatives and trying to influence and change that cosy relationship of kind of sordid entanglement, if you like, and to try and get a democratic media that works for democracy. So today's panel will be talking about some of the opportunities that are around now to ensure that we do have a journalism of integrity and independent media that works for democracy. We are joined again by Hani Barghouthi, who is the head of advocacy, this time wearing the hat of the head of advocacy of the Public Interest News Foundation. For those of you who don't know PINF, which is how we all refer to it, it is the UK's first charity to support public interest news, with a mission to ensure the social and financial sustainability of independent news providers in communities across the UK. PINF have been working very closely around trying to get into a bill called the, I always get this wrong, so I have to look at my notes, the Digital Markets, Competition and Consumers Bill, trying to enable independent publishers to get what they deserve from big tech legislation. And you may have heard of things like the News Bargaining Code in Australia and Canada, and most recently something happening in Indonesia. And that's what Hani has been working a lot on in the UK. So we're going to get an update on that and to see what are the possibilities and dangers maybe ahead of us there. Then we'll go to Hamish Gibson, who is head of membership at Impress. Impress is the independent monitor for the press, the first and only Leveson-compliant regulator. Impress now regulates over 219 publications, but they are much more than a regulator. They do lots of other things. They do research, they do training, they also do lobbying with a view to, again, trying to create an environment where news providers can publish with integrity to serve the public good. And then finally, we're going to turn to Tom Chivers, who is the campaign coordinator for the Media Reform Coalition, who has been involved in lobbying on multiple fronts in the policy environment, and has also drawn up the media manifesto for the Media Reform Coalition, which lays out all of the many things we think need to change in a political sense for us to have a media that is the sort of media that we'd all like to see working for democracy. So I'm going to ask each of the panel to speak for about 8 minutes, and then again we will come over to you to open the conversation up. You're kind of weirdly spread in a strange sense, so I'll keep turning around, but please have your questions ready. So firstly, Hani.
Thank you, Natalie. It's been an interesting year to work in policy. I think everyone's known that a general election has been coming for quite a while, and I think because of that, the front bench for both main parties have held their cards quite close to their chests. Like you said, it's been quite difficult to get complete open conversations with them about the things that we care about. Like you said, I've been focused on the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Bill. Well done on getting it right. Sometimes it's still confusing to me as well. And so just a very, very quick introduction for that bill. It's going to empower a new regulator to regulate the UK's digital market. It's going to focus on really large players that it will call, that will have strategic market status. Those are companies like Google, like Meta, and it's meant to regulate the relationship that they have with third parties that they interact with. So the third parties that we care about obviously are small independent publishers. And we want to make sure, we've been working since 2022 to make sure that whatever version of this bill passes will be one that's that will empower small indie publishers to negotiate fairly for compensation, basically for good, fair, and reasonable terms with the world's largest companies. And just to give you a little bit of background about the kind of publishers that we work with, those are small indie publishers around the UK. Every year we do the PINF Index of Independent News Publishing, which is a survey of about 100 or so publishers. Our 2024 survey will come out in the next couple of months, but I can tell you a little bit about what we learned last year. Those publishers are normally sole traders, or they have 1 to 2 employees. They have a turnover of £89,000 a year, but they have really high readership. They reach large audiences, and they're much more, and based on this research and research that we've done before, we know that communities are much more likely to trust news if they know that it came from someone who produced it from within their community, if it's locally owned rather than by a giant corporation. So these are the publishers that we work with. These are the publishers that we want to support because we think that they do the kind of journalism that espouses the values that we care about, like fairness, transparency. They help communities engage in democratic life around them, and they help them really understand how they relate to the world. But they need a lot of help. It's an innovative, but it's a fragile sector. It has lots of different people trying to figure out different ways to get it towards sustainability. We think that the Digital Markets Bill is one piece of that puzzle. We think there's a whole slate of policy that needs to be done, as well as public shifts in public perspective that need to happen in order for us to get to a place where the sector is able to support itself, is able to grow, to thrive, to do the work that it does so well. So the Digital Markets Bill, the bits that we care about is we want to make sure that because these are normally, they're essentially the mom and pop shops of journalism. So they don't have huge legal resources. They don't have the time to enter lengthy legal battles with the world's largest companies that have incredibly deep pockets. So we've been working really hard to make sure that these publishers will be able to come together in and bargain collectively with the companies. We want to make sure that the regulatory process is as transparent, as speedy, as expeditious as possible. and we want to really limit the opportunities for these giant firms with the world's most talented lobbyists working for them have as few opportunities as possible to obstruct regulation. The bill is, I think, in good shape. We're seeing its final stages. It's at report stage in the House of Lords right now, which means fairly soon it'll be voted on. The final form will be voted on, and then will receive royal assent. We and other players in the media sector have made really good progress, I think, in terms of getting it to a place where it will enable this new regulator to regulate with confidence, with a pretty firm hand. But as important as the work on the actual bill has been for the past couple of years, the next stage of regulation is going to be incredibly important. So right now, one of the things that we've realized is that the public understands local news, they know what local news is. There's kind of a missing link when we talk about independent news, where there's not much of an awareness around what that is. So in addition to the policy work that we're doing, we are also doing a lot of work on defining that and communicating the value of this sector to the public. And part of that work also links into the policy advocacy that we're doing. So later this year, we're going to be running a campaign called Indie News Week under the banner of No News is Bad News. And publishers from up and down the UK will be able to participate. The point is to raise their profile within their communities, as well as communicate the value of what it means to be an independent news publisher on a national level. And part of the research that we're doing into the value of indie news is we're working with, and this is where it ties into the regulation, we're going to be working with sector partners like Impress and like the MRC to design and experiment with some economists, a behavioral economics experiment that will, on Google. So the idea is that we'll measure what the value of news is to Google, and hopefully that's something that we'll be able to use later on when we start talking about actual bargaining with Google under this new regulatory framework. So we're working on there are lots of different strands of work to help people understand what independent media is, to communicate to the government, to the regulator, to the big tech companies, what the value of the independent sector is. And at the same time, we have started we're just about to launch a local news commission. And this is our most specific project with a look ahead to the general election, which is we think there are lots of policy ideas, like I said, that need to be explored. And we also don't need all of these policy ideas to come just from us. So we know, for example, that we really care about the digital markets bill. We know that public notice spending absolutely urgently needs reform. But there are also lots of policy ideas that we think can come from other sources. And there are lots of sectors that are affected by journalism and that affect journalism. So in the next few months, we're going to be launching this local news commission, and our commissioners are going to be fairly high profile, fairly influential people who work in sectors like business associations, trade unions, faith groups, civil society. We're bringing together, hopefully, a really broad church of actors that will be able to bring fresh perspectives to the conversation on local news and also speak authoritatively to the public and to people in power. And I think I just rushed through that. But in brief, digital markets bill going well. Hopefully, it will continue to go great. Indie News Week, very excited about that. That's happening the first week of June, and with buy-in already from lots of publishers in every nation and everywhere in the UK. But we're hoping to keep that growing, and lots of policy proposals coming via the local news commission.
Any sights on the election?
What do you mean?
As in any targeted campaigning around election time?
So we're hoping to use what comes out of the local news commission on that, and to make sure that the progress that we've made on the digital markets bill will continue. I think we were very heartened to see that Tangam Debonair, who's going to be who's a shadow frontbencher, mentioned journalism in her budget speech. So I think there are definitely going to be ins there. We're just really concerned with making sure that the status quo, wherein the large corporates have had kind of all of the lobbying power and have had the most influence in this sector, hopefully is not carried forward into whatever the future government is, whatever the next coming government is.
Great, thank you very much. Hamish.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Is that okay? Great. Yeah, so as Natalie says, Impress is an independent press regulator, which means that we work directly with news publishers, many of whom are the small indie ones that Hani speaks about, and the public in ultimately delivering a media that works in the interests of both. So this means that when it comes to policy, our interest is threefold. We want to incentivize and champion those news publishers that sign up to be independently held accountable, to recognize standards of journalism. We want to foster and grow a literate and resilient public who engage constructively with the news and, by extension, democracy. And ultimately, we want to encourage and facilitate a healthy relationship between the two, which is what we also do in our day-to-day work. So to do this at the moment, or to deliver this, what we're developing is a policy vision that's composed of 6 key pillars, where we're looking at bringing kind of all the loose strands of media policy into one coherent vision that we want to kind of work together with people on, and we hope that this will provide a useful basis for developing policy solutions that are both targeted and holistic. So what we really want to do at the moment is use our position to invite contributions and collaborations throughout the sector, which means that this is very much an open offer to everyone here, that we would love to work with others on that. So what I'll do is I'll kind of give a brief, hopefully not too brief, outline of what those 6 pillars are. And just a word on the methodology as well. What we have done is we spent a few months kind of essentially doing an extensive literature review and doing some desk research of the current policy landscape, of active legislation, of what similar organizations, what trade bodies, private bodies are all speaking about, and now we did a thematic analysis in which we drew from that, and now we're in a stage of consultation while we kind of figure out the best avenues for taking that forward. So, on to the 6 pillars. So the first one is cultural life and human rights, and we believe this one is foundational and kind of underpins the rest of our model, in that it concerns the nature of the role that all media, news, cultural or otherwise, plays in our day-to-day lives, alongside the importance of emphasizing human and civil rights throughout this model. So amongst other things, that means recognizing journalism's unique role in today's media ecosystem, addressing the overlaps between news and different media forms, improving access to justice when human and civil rights are breached, and reforming national security laws that encroach on human rights. So the second pillar is community media, and this relates quite directly to what is currently being termed the levelling up agenda, but knowing how kind of, flippant this kind of thing can be, who knows what that'll be called in 12 months' time. But this one addresses local empowerment of media providers from the ground up, so engaging relevant authorities at the regional, local, regional and devolved levels to recognise the importance of working with local and diverse news media, and ultimately strengthening local democratic resilience in the process by emphasising accessibility throughout local governance structures. So the third pillar is public literacy, and this addresses civic and public engagement through the lens of promoting media literacy, which both ours and many others' research has shown to be a key driver of positive democratic participation, as well as a bulwark of resilience against the likes of mis and disinformation. So the current solutions we're looking at for this are kind of, as you would expect, kind of increased literacy grants and deeper integration of media and news literacy within educational curriculums. So the fourth pillar is labour and economy, and so this one, at Impress, we talk a lot about standards in media and journalism, and quality journalism and what that can look like. And I think it's quite important to consider that it can be quite difficult to focus on delivering the best quality journalism when you don't have job security. It can be done, but it's very difficult. So as well as ethical standards, what we need to be looking at is developing conditions that centre labour rights, cement diversity, and prevent anti-competitive monopolies. So also, when we look, I think, at creative and cultural policy, and I've heard this mentioned a few times today, solutions very often take a jobs focus that otherwise tends to be quite lacking in news media policy. So we should be looking at how we can empower the media to upskill new generations of media workers, which Matt was also touching on this morning, and protect existing workforces, particularly freelancers. I mean, we just look at like the recent mass job losses at large outlets, corporate deployment of automated tech, and the insecurities faced by freelancers who are particularly at risk at the moment. So what we need to be looking at is sustainable career development models that improve skills retention and keep those skills within the sector. I think too often at the moment, a lot of skills that are developed within journalism are just going elsewhere, and that's transferring into other sectors, so that media is kind of losing out as a result. Local journalism is also a huge petri dish for training and developing new talent, and so we should be looking at how we can strengthen these pathways and others so that we can improve journalism's contribution to local and national economic growth whilst, and this is key, is protecting the labour that upholds and produces it in the first place. And so the fifth pillar is online governance, and this one covers what is probably on a lot of, or most people's minds when we talk about media today, including some of the issues that were intended to be covered by the Online Safety Act, but also looking further afield and beyond that. So when we talk about AI, deepfakes, content verification, economic tensions in the digital industries, we're often touching on online governance. And in part, this comes back to cultural life and human rights, particularly thinking about the definitions that we apply within policy and legislation and making sure that these definitions, as well as mechanisms, are designed by relevant experts and fit for purpose today. I think what comes up more often than not is that the definitions we're using of journalism are very much kind of out of date and is something that needs to be kind of reset and revised today. So governing and regulating digital services in the online world is hugely complex, to say the least. But when we look at the dangers of mis and disinformation, deepfakes, first impression bias, and the exploitation and abuse that emerges and thrives within vacuums, we can quite easily see what's at stake when we don't have the proper mechanisms and processes in place. So above all else, we need to be looking at ways that we can equip our infrastructure to deal with the threats that, among all else, AI poses. And I'm not as kind of doom-laden when it comes to what AI might do, but I think the threats are incredibly real, and so we need to prepare for them regardless. And so the sixth and last pillar is distribution, and this last one cuts across all of the previous ones, in that it addresses the infrastructure behind media content, behind all media content. So in light of the improved accessibility of mass publishing tools, distribution methods are even more needing proper scrutiny of their role in the disseminating and legitimizing of information. And we could be looking at live broadcasting and the role of public service broadcasting in the wider ecosystem, which I believe Tom might come on to in a bit more detail. We could be looking at mobile app stores and regulatory approaches to maintaining mass digital infrastructure. And we could even be looking at just the printing press and the cases of political party newsletters producing fake newspapers. So in all cases, we need technical and regulatory measures that will protect the infrastructural integrity underpinning all media content. We need to incentivize greater cooperation on standards and skill sharing between distributors, producers, the public, and civil society. And we need to, at the end of all of that, ensure the viability of public interest information that depends on these channels. Otherwise, as is currently the case, that system's vulnerabilities will be ripe for exploitation. So that's a kind of broad outline. It's still evolving. Like I say, we're kind of still in the consultation stage on that, so we very much want to work with everyone to keep developing it and building it into something that can proactively inform solutions-based work across media and policy spaces, and then that includes also identifying opportunities, such as if there's anything in the run-up to the election that we can then kind of work together on. And if anyone would like to know more about that, you can either visit our website and follow us, or very welcome to reach out to me personally.
I mean, that's, for any of you who know the other press regulator in the space, IPSO, who the so-called Independent Press Standards organisation, who is not independent at all and doesn't do anything around standards. That little 6 pillars outline is so extraordinary in this landscape that you would never in a million years get IPSO talking in those terms. So it is very encouraging to actually hear that we have a press regulator that is thinking not of protecting the press to do whatever they want to do, but is thinking in a much more holistic way about how we can have a media landscape that will enable democracy to flourish. So I think, great. Tom, over to you.
Great, thank you. I think I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that the Media Reform Coalition has been doing around public service broadcasting, some of our work around lobbying the media bill, which has been rushed through Parliament or is being rushed through Parliament at this very moment, and then kind of talk about some of our plans and ideas for reform of the BBC, which has kind of, the role of the BBC has kind of been an unspoken undercurrent of a lot of the discussions we've had today. Before I do that, I'll talk about our media manifesto, which is freely available outside, many copies for you to take home, peruse, digest, help us campaign and promote. Clearly, I think what we've heard from the discussions today is that not only is our media not serving democracy, but in many cases it is actively harming our democracy. And if we want to have a media that serves democracy, then we need not just major regulatory changes, new models, but entirely new conceptions of what media exists to do. So that's part of what our manifesto kind of outlines, is a plan for tackling the abuses and concentrations of media power, which Natalie spoke about at the start. It's about a new deal for local media, which both Hani and Hamish have spoken about. It's about providing public, non-commercial, alternative digital and internet infrastructure for how we deal with online media. And then looking to the future, it's about what we will call for as one of our kind of election priorities is a commission on the media and democracy, to have a wider conversation, exactly the conversations we've been having today, about what is the media's role in democracy, how have changes in technology changed that role, or what new kind of structures, models do we need to address the challenges of the future, like climate change, war and conflict, economic disparity, and so on. But on public service broadcasting, we've had 20, 30 years of continuing attacks on not just the BBC as an institution, but on public service broadcasting as a concept, as an idea and set of principles about organising a non-commercial, publicly owned alternative to most of the media, which is so captured by powerful corporations, powerful individuals. And we clearly see that in the BBC as well, in that the BBC is currently failing in its role as a public service broadcaster, and clearly a lot needs to be done to fix it. Media policy is not an exciting topic, which is a shame for me because it's all I want to talk about, and it's very difficult to get people to talk about it and be interested in it, especially politicians who will say, we love going on the media and we love being interviewed, but why should we care about media policy? Everything's working just fine, at least it's working fine for them. But what we've had is an unending sequence of deregulation of public service broadcasting, commercialisation of public service broadcasting, defunding of the BBC, direct political interference in the BBC through appointments of its chair, through attacks on its independence in terms of its reporting, through the kind of manifestation of micro scandals like Gary Lineker or coverage of Gaza or responses to various accusations of bias. And there are biases in BBC coverage, but they are treated often as kind of, like I say, micro scandals that are dealt with and have a sudden slapshot response from government or the BBC and then forgotten about. And then we've got the media bill, which is being celebrated by almost all parties in the House of Commons and the House of Lords as a fantastic opportunity to support our wonderful world-leading public service broadcasters and, of course, to free the press by repealing the only remaining evidence that the phone hacking scandal ever happened. It's extraordinary the speed at which the media bill has been rushed through Parliament, because 5 years ago Ofcom said quite clearly our public service broadcasters are not seen as relevant by large parts of the audiences. They are no longer easily accessible by audiences because of the growth of new digital technologies. And a lot needs to happen to secure them and make sure they are sustainable for the future. That was 5 years ago, and in the time since, we've had Nadine Dorries basically announcing the end of the licence fee. We've had the attempted privatisation of Channel 4, all of these other delays and distractions and political attacks. And now suddenly the government has realised, oh, we're not going to be in power much longer. Let's rush through this media bill at the last minute and say what a wonderful job we're doing for our public service broadcasters. But at the core of the media bill, as well as this getting rid of this so-called liberation of the press from Section 40, has been an attempt to continually or increase the commercialisation of public service broadcasting and to undermine and rewrite the fundamental purposes of what it exists to do. So, for example, the phrase inform, educate and entertain, a phrase we associate with the BBC but applies to all of our public service broadcasters, the government wants to remove that from the legislation so that it will no longer be a part of what public service broadcasting exists to do in this country. Instead, public service broadcasting will be defined as just a few objectives like providing news, providing programming for children, representing the nations and region, which are important objectives, but they don't describe all of the things that public service broadcasting is meant to do as a universal, non-commercial, publicly owned and publicly driven intervention in the media. We have been able, through some lobbying and campaigning around the media bill, to not delay the bill so much as just to make the politicians realise if you go through with this, you will be setting public service broadcasting on the path to its end by redefining it as something which it isn't. And we're hoping that the House of Lords will introduce an amendment to the government's planned media bill that kind of reintroduces those core purposes and principles of what PSB is meant to do. Unfortunately, I think the fight is lost on Section 40 because Labour aren't going to suddenly stand up and oppose the great power of the press because they need them to get into power. The Conservatives have been promising to get rid of Section 40 for effectively since it was introduced. From 2014 onwards, they said we've just introduced this and now we're going to get rid of it. So in our kind of lobbying work, we are hopefully succeeding in getting those principles put back in, but that will not be the end of the story for public service broadcasting. And all that will really do is put us back at the kind of status quo of these are the principles we want, but they're still not being implemented effectively by Ofcom, by the public service broadcasters. So there needs to be a wider transformational and structural reform of what public service broadcasting exists to do and what it should achieve. And I guess I'll just talk for a few minutes on our proposals around the BBC in particular, because as I say, the BBC has failed and is still failing at its core public service goals to be a universal, representative, publicly owned public service broadcaster, and it's increasingly detached from the public that it exists to serve. We are all, hopefully, licence fee payers. We all support this idea, or we should all support this idea of a communal, collective investment in public media that serves us rather than serving profits and commercial objectives. But through commercialisation of the BBC in its charter, through political attacks on its independence, political appointees and so on, it is sort of increasingly unable to achieve those aims. And that hasn't been done by accident. That has been a decades-long campaign of interference, underfunding and commercialisation. We've seen this, this kind of transparently happening before our eyes without any real comment from opposition parties to say this is not what we want from our public broadcasting. The BBC is treated as this kind of political tool that can be thrown back and forth. We've seen, the appointment of Richard Sharp, who was a leading figure at Goldman Sachs and Rishi Sunak's boss, who was appointed as the chair of BBC despite being a major Tory donor. We have Robbie Gibb, who's recently just been reappointed as the non-executive director for England, but his role in the BBC is far more kind of pervasive and insidious, where he effectively acts as a direct link between the Conservative Party and the BBC's main governance, where there have been quite substantial allegations that he's meddling directly in editorial affairs, which is not the role of a non-executive director. And we've seen what we are constantly seeing, and even going on at this moment, are these secretive government panels where the government says we want to do something about the BBC, we want to change its funding model, we want to change the way its regulation works, but we're not going to involve the public in this process. This will be something that we as the government with the kind of ultimate authority over the BBC will decide on our own in private, and the idea that there might be even civil society consultation, let alone public consultation on these issues, just simply does not factor into the government's thinking on the BBC. There have been some positive hints from Labour that they will seek to protect the BBC, but I think all we've really heard is that they'll just sort of try and kind of take it back to this imagined golden age where there wasn't that much government interference in the BBC, and maybe there'll be some kind of independent appointments process for who is the chair, and that's where they're stopped. But there's no real grand vision from the major political parties to recognise that the BBC as a kind of cultural and social institution, as an institution that should represent and reflect us, it is failing to do that. It has just become a kind of captured, moribund, mainstream media institution that is kind of captured within its own logics of journalism and creative processes. But we in our manifesto do have proposals for radical reform to the appointments processes, to actually democratise them, so it's not just a panel appoints a panel, appoints a panel, appoints a chair, but the public are directly involved in electing the board of the BBC. We are licence fee payers, or under a new model we will be fee payers, universal fee payers of the BBC. We should have direct roles in what happens and how that organisation is structured. Obviously, reform of funding is going to be a major political battle, perhaps one of the almighty political battles that the next Labour government will face. We have really not heard any indications that they're going to do anything progressive about this. I think the most likely thing is they will simply continue the licence fee, but maybe add some dangerous, unnecessary safeguards to how it works without really changing the fundamental model. We want to see it moved away from a kind of regressive tax and onto a more progressive system that isn't tied to do you watch TV, do you watch iPlayer, but actually a recognition that a collective cultural and social contribution to media is an essential part of our democracy, and it should be continued without all of these strings attached of political renewal processes or what we call top slicing, where pieces of BBC funding are kind of forced to be allotted to other bits and pieces. Again, it should be up to us as the owners of the BBC to decide where the funding is going. So introducing new participatory models that involve us as the owners of the BBC in where that money goes. Greater distribution to the regions and the nations, greater direct public participation in the production of programmes, greater public oversight of the regulatory processes. I could go on and on. I imagine this is, but I won't, as much as I wish I could, because anyone who actually listens to me about policy gets tired very quickly. But that's our sort of, in our manifesto we have a grand vision that just sort of says our media isn't working, it isn't serving democracy, it is harming democracy in many cases. Let's go down there, those are the reforms we want to see, and I hope questions will ask about what we can do. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. So you've heard some visions for how the media landscape could be reformed in very key ways. 2 bills going through Parliament now and a general election on the horizon. We don't know when it is, but it's likely to be November now. So what can we do about it? We'd love to hear from you. Any questions to the panel and any thoughts about what we can do? I can see Roger over there. Oh, I need somebody to take a mic, actually. Oh, Gollum, here, we'll do the running around with the mic. Thank you, Paul. Thanks, Gollum.
The media monopolies need to be broken up. The toxic relationship between corrupt media and corrupt politics needs to end. We need to move towards a model where we have publicly owned media across the platform, but not run by the government, but run by self-governing trusts. We're not going to get that from the Tories, and we're not going to get that from counterfeit Labour either. So what I've been talking about for a long time, and I talked about this at the last conference that we had at Birkbeck, was the possibility that some of the trade unions' political levy that currently goes to the Labour Party or to another initiatives could actually go to funding an independent platform that brings together working class interests, environmental interests, anti-fascist, community, anti-war, debt crisis of the third world, so on and so forth, and actually organises a kind of platform that is financed by our labour movement. The way I envisage it would be that possibly base it outside of the UK, because we've now got this National Security Act, and we've already had political show trials of people like Carol Cadwallader proving that that journalism has always been criminalised in this country. So we go somewhere where journalists have rights, also where our assets can't be sequestrated. And before I have to go anymore, I'd love to know what you think about that idea.
Thank you, Sylvia. Gollum.
Question to Tom. How can you radically reform the board of the BBC through some form of public involvement when at the moment half the BBC is in-house? Do you see what I mean? That's a practical issue, isn't it, or a practical problem? Because at the moment, the new board stands or falls on that idea of a combination of the in-house and out-of-house. Okay.
Any others? No, before we go over? Okay, so to all of you, trade union funding of a platform for media and sort of labour, struggles, leftist struggles across the board. Anyone want to go first?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a very interesting idea, and I think it's kind of very refreshing compared to the kind of general uniformity we kind of see across the current sector. I guess just the devil would very much be in the detail on it, and in terms of like how it's run. Obviously, I mean, coming from a regulator, we would be questioning like how the kind of standards are drawn up, and then but there would be like multiple questions like that. Obviously, it would be a huge organization which would need a lot of work from different stakeholders. So I think it is a very interesting one, but I guess it would be as with any media organization is looking at like the kind of the checks and balances you have in place, how you're held to account, the kind of transparency that works throughout that, and very much the kind of the same questions that Tom mentions that we would be asking of the BBC, I think. But yeah, very interesting idea.
I very much agree with Hamish. I think we would just need to, it's a very interesting idea, and safeguards for independence of something like this. We care very much about publishers not being aligned with political parties, not being aligned with specific groups, and speaking and kind of echoing their interests. And we would just need to do the same. That would need to be ensured.
I guess one of my questions would be, Roger, is even though we've had a rise of, kind of labour activism in the movement the past 12 months, trade union membership numbers are still falling. So, there's still an issue of whether the trade union movement would be able to sustainably fund something at the level which would be necessary, but it's certainly worthwhile having that conversation. Tom?
Yeah, just very quickly to Roger, yes, I agree completely. And alongside that, I think within our manifesto, we talk about creating greater opportunities for kind of collaboration and cooperation between all these different forces in civil society for new avenues of funding media, new ways of bringing different forces that aren't necessarily part of the media, but nonetheless rely on it a lot, like universities, local councils, local healthcare institutions. So yeah, I agree completely with that and what the others have said. Sylvia, we're very much at risk of going too much into the weeds and sending everyone to sleep this late in the day. But on that question of the board, yeah, I agree. I think you can have a split in a BBC board between the kind of top-level oversight governance arrangements, which are directly accountable to the public. But then within the BBC, you have, there needs to be a greater deal of workplace democracy within the BBC, where those who are the kind of inner executives within the BBC aren't just kind of appointed by the board or selected in kind of strange, arcane arrangements, but actually it's the BBC staff, the journalists, the creators, the management, the runners, all of the many thousands of BBC staff who say these are the people who we think are right to lead our organisation and to kind of undertake the principles that we are set.
Deb's at the back, and then Des.
Thanks, everyone. I would like to know, and I would definitely like Natalie to also answer this question as someone who's worked in this space for such a long time. What do you think is actually winnable out of this election?
Des.
Yeah, very good question, because my answer is not a lot. And I don't know, I'm picking up a slight, either it's late in the day or else you guys have a very tough job in generating some excitement about an election in which many people are frankly pretty indifferent because of the lack of political choices. So there's a stark difference between the significance of the issues, and we've heard about them all day. This is a matter of life and death when it comes to Gaza. It's genuinely, or about the possibilities of making sure that that we should be facilitating a digital landscape that's not going to be dominated by corporations or governments. So both preventing the negative, but trying to, get something good out of all of this. And it feels like the election is a million miles because of the lack of alternatives being given to us. So the conclusion to that is, first of all, thank God you're doing this, Tom, and I'm very grateful to you. But really, given, I think you said actually, Tom, that Starmer is not going to take any kind of position on press reform because he needs the press. He doesn't need the press. This is the classic. Starmer is going to walk over the line with or without the press. It is partly political cowardice, partly this is a tradition by all politicians over so many years, a perception of the press, even though, as Gaza quite clearly demonstrates, the public are miles to the left of the media on all of this. But there is this, lack of appetite for it. So, will how do you make this relevant to people? I mean, should it just be politely lobbying, which sounds like you've made some inroads on, or should it actually be, well, in a way, the election is only important if we're talking to the voters and not to the parliamentarians? How do you inject some excitement into something which, frankly, for many people is a very dull, depressing event?
Thanks, Tess. I've got lots I could say, but I'm going to...
No, I can come back on that quickly and say, yeah, I'm always have to sort of strike myself and say, yes, you may be having some success in lobbying Parliament, but Parliament as an institution is already clearly so sort of institutionally bound to some of these media structures which we know are failing. So yes, we may have been able to convince enough people in the House of Lords that there are these nice principles of public service broadcasting that should be enshrined. But like I say, that's not the end of the story. And that just that happening on its own, it may be a nice success for me to say, I made this happen. But that still leaves us in this situation where the broader institutions of our media are failing. I think where we can, or hopefully an opportunity to bring some excitement and some radical activity into this debate will be BBC Charter Review, which will be a sort of almighty clash of all of these different forces concentrated on what is the real future of the BBC, how should it be regulated, how should it be constituted. And so I think the opportunity is there for us, as we're starting to outline in the manifesto, as Debs has done with the BBC and Beyond project, which hopefully copies are still available outside, is to say that we can't just keep lumbering through these same debates of, oh, we'll tinker on the edges of the Charter here, and maybe Labour will sort of improve the government's arrangements a bit. No, we have to say everything about our media is failing, and yet we have this one institution here which is within our gift to radically change, and we have to take the opportunity to do that and start the pressure now on the next government, which may be the Labour Party. I think what they've been saying in their kind of glossy, nicey way about the arts and the creative industries and how important they are to culture and to social cohesion, we can simply say to them, all these arguments apply to our media system. And here you have an opportunity with BBC Charter Review, which again I don't think is the end of the story, but is an opportunity to start these steps towards a more democratic media and to make the case for not just keeping these institutions as they are and sort of saying we like them more than the Tories, but genuinely changing them.
And I think you're absolutely right. I think we've really set our sights on the public with recent strands of work. We're doing this Indie News Week, which is very much just aimed at the public, at helping them understand the value of indie news and therefore helping them understand what's at stake if indie news can't survive this economy, for what it's worth. And I think other work that we're doing, like the Local News Commission, that's also aimed at the public in addition to policymakers. We're also trying to return some of the decision-making power to communities in this local news fund. So right now we're running a local news fund, which is a pilot program. And the idea is to put money in a fund for local journalism in a community and then put the decision-making power for what that fund looks like, how that fund is distributed within the community itself. So it's participatory grant making, which is something that Debs has worked on with us before. So I think we're still obviously very interested in getting to the policymakers. We're going to try to keep doing that, but we also need a shift in public perception and in public action. We have people in the UK, people are just not willing to pay for the news at large, and that's one of the key components, I think, in getting to sustainability, which is not going to be a piece of the puzzle that we're able to forget. So we really need to move our attention there as well.
Yeah, kind of partly to kind of echo a lot of what's just been said. I mean, I haven't been directly involved in the lobbying kind of aspect enough to answer what can be one, but I think in terms of like looking at media policy priorities, I think one of the priorities has to be kind of media policy itself and kind of getting that high up the agenda in a way that it just hasn't typically been. And I think once we kind of get that through the door, then it's potentially going to be a bit easier to start kind of looking at what that can look like. And I think that would also give us an opportunity to kind of like challenge some of the kind of generic lines that tend to get pushed through in the kind of discourse in the UK. I think like when we look at Section 40, there's so much kind of baggage attached to that in terms of the way that it's spoken about. And I think I would agree with Tom in terms of like that's kind of in the past now, but in terms of the associations with it, and I think the way that power leans in the country in terms of who gets to decide what means what when we talk about things like press freedom and freedom of expression. I think if we were able to get the concept of media policy higher up the agenda, I think that would give us a chance to properly unpack that and look at how we can then kind of start getting everything we're talking about more through.
And because you asked me to comment, Debs, I will. But I mean, I share all of your pessimism around the general election that we have before us as being very limited choice and not a lot likely to change. But I don't any longer see elections as being necessarily about, a major shift in policy from one government to the next. I see it about as an opportunity to engage with a citizenry who are going to the polls. So that what is winnable is bringing issues of relating to media reform to a broader public and saying, actually, of course, all of these other issues, health, education, war, are vitally important, but unless we reform our media in key ways, we will never actually win some of those arguments either, because they are all distorted and framed in particular ways in our mainstream media, as we've heard all day. So it's getting people to more fully engage. The one opportunity we did have around the hacking scandal was because of the outrage that caused when it was revealed that a murdered teenager had her phone hacked. And then suddenly it became common knowledge that phone hacking was taking place on an industrial scale. Now, it's not that the media have completely cleaned up their act, they've just changed their approach in doing different things in different ways. And so we need a moment, and an election is a moment when we can have those debates. So I think what's winnable, and one of the things we've put in the manifesto is similar to PIMP's having a local commission, a commission on local news, is we've said, let's have a media commission. Let's look in detail. The media landscape is changing dramatically and quickly because of new technology. What we need to do is have joined up policy and understanding that will function and work. We've heard today about how Ofcom is failing and can't do it because any policy that comes through, they just turn around and say, give it to Ofcom, they'll do it. Ofcom won't do it. They don't have enough people. It's impossible for them to deal with the online safety bill that's just come through. They will need to appoint hundreds and hundreds of new members of staff in order to deliver that regulation. And at the moment, there's no signs that's happening. So it's, we can't rely on Ofcom. We need a whole new understanding of how our media ecology is functioning and what we want it to do. And that has to be a conversation that takes place in the public realm. So I think that is where we need to focus our attention and all of the things actually that we've heard from PIMP and Impress and from Tom here with the MRC are trying to do that. That's where I think wins lie, is actually really raising awareness, raising consciousness around these issues within the public.
So can I just make a very quick point on another kind of example of why we can be optimistic? Just within the last week, we've had all politicians unite against the idea that foreign governments should own our newspapers, which is absolutely correct. But then it's so easy to make the next step and say, well, perhaps giant corporations shouldn't own large portions of our press, or perhaps media moguls who have interest in all these different pots and are so clearly having an excessive and abusive influence on our politics, they also shouldn't own major parts of our media. So there are going to be, this is one of the examples of those debates where politicians are confronted with the reality of our failing media and they can't get away with ignoring it. They are forced into these kinds of responses where they have to say, well, actually there are some fundamental democratic principles in how our media should be run, and we will immediately do something to correct that. And that's an opportunity for us to say, okay, great, you've made that first step. Here's 500 other steps you can go and make next to continue that sort of trend.
We are sadly out of time, but I'm going to say before you go, please, everybody, sign up to the Media Reform Coalition, join the work that's happening at PIMP, and if you are an independent media, join Impress. and join the movement for media reform. Thank you all very much.
Subscribe to your local